time is an illusion these days, but it was only 2 months ago that the United States military invaded Venezuela, arrested dictator Nicolas Maduro, and hijacked the country's entire oil production industry. This was all done in the name of law and order. But the facade that this is done in the name of protecting the homeland from narcos is crumbling. The Wall Street Journal just broke a remarkable story documenting a direct link between the CIA and a former Chevron executive. No surprises, from this backroom deal, Chevron now appears set for a massive windfall. Meanwhile, the US government remains committed to the bid. Federal prosecutors want former President Maduro to get a really long criminal sentence over drug trafficking charges brought against him. And I was there, in the Manhattan courtroom, where it all happened.
Bueno, fue un momento muy impactante. Yo he cubierto muchos casos de personas que han sido imputadas de varios cargos. Nunca había visto a un presidente o un expresidente siendo acusado de la forma como lo es Maduro.
Before we get to the courtroom, there's something you should know about the military operation that captured Maduro. According to an explosive new report by the Wall Street Journal, Ali Moshiri, a former Chevron executive who ran Chevron in Venezuela when the US closed its embassy in 2019, the CIA lost its intelligence resources. The agency then turned to people with deep ties to the country's oil industry. Moshiri had been at Chevron for 30 years and had been the company's point man in Venezuela since the early 2000s. Moshiri became the most important window into the activities of Venezuela's political leaders. He advised the US government that the Venezuelan opposition might struggle to govern effectively if Maduro was removed. He even suggested that the US back an insider from within the Maduro regime. He recommended Delcy Rodriguez, who, no surprise here, is now the acting president of Venezuela under US control. Now, Chevron says it had nothing to do with intelligence work, but the episode tells you something important. Long before Maduro ever appeared in a courtroom, the people thinking about Venezuela were not just DEA agents and prosecutors. The country's fate was being decided by intelligence officials, diplomats, and oil industry executives. Where else have I heard about the CIA getting involved in a South American nation and then forcing a very brutal regime change? Sounds familiar. Maybe I was born there. Anyway, none of this is likely to matter much in court. Under a long-standing Supreme Court rule known as the Kerr-Frisbee Doctrine, quote, the power of a court to try a person for crime is not impaired by the fact that he had been brought within the court's jurisdiction by reason of a forcible abduction. So even if intelligence officials and oil execs helped plot Maduro's capture, that's not enough to stop the trial. All of that intelligence and geopolitical maneuvering ultimately led to one place, a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan. On Monday, January 5th, I was in a federal courtroom in Manhattan when Nicolas Maduro, the deposed dictator of Venezuela, was arraigned on criminal charges. That's right. I was in the room where it all went down, and blow by blow, I witnessed history. The US government brought the forcibly captured leader of Venezuela before a US judge and accused him of a host of crimes, most notably narcoterrorism. In this singular legal action, the Trump administration will now be forced to grant due process of the laws to a powerful Venezuelan after denying that same basic legal right to the everyday Venezuelans his administration treats as enemies of the state. But the moment Maduro entered the courtroom and began declaring his status as the president of Venezuela, it was apparent that this so-called law enforcement operation, which the FBI and the military conducted supposedly to execute a criminal warrant, had very little to do with law enforcement. It didn't feel normal. This has nothing to do with drugs or narcoterrorism. And I can prove it because Donald Trump is equally obsessed with another Latin American narco strongman, Juan Orlando Hernandez. Hernandez left office in Honduras in 2022, and within weeks, he was in DEA custody. He stood trial in the same courthouse on similar charges, was convicted, and sentenced to 45 years in prison. But not 1 month before Trump invaded Venezuela to enforce the law, he did the unthinkable. He gave Hernandez a presidential pardon.
This was a man who was persecuted very unfairly.
And this goes to show you how quickly a nation can go from holding other nations to its standards of justice to grossly violating that same standard of justice within its own borders. Which is why I made a full video about how ICE hijacked immigration enforcement and how it can be abolished. But the only place you can watch it is on Nebula, the sponsor of today's video. Nebula is a streaming service where you can watch all the content from your favorite creators like Jetlag, Maggie May Fish, Real Engineering, Philosophy Tube, Real Life Lore, and of course, LegalEagle, ad-free and early. Plus, watch tons of other Nebula exclusives made with love, time, effort, and increased budgets that you won't find on YouTube. I highly recommend you check out Lindsay Ellis's original documentary, The Macabre World of Police Body Cam YouTube. It's a fascinating expose on how this wildly popular genre of true crime content is altering social attitudes about the law and policing. In fact, every LegalEagle video we make is an extended cut on Nebula, from legal analysis of improv comedy scenes Devin did with Brennan Lee Mulligan to my breakdown of why federal judges are fed up with SCOTUS. All our videos on Nebula contain a ton more insight, analysis, and even hilarious moments that we had to cut from the YouTube version. And if you use my link or code, you can get 50% off an annual subscription or 40% off a lifetime of Nebula. Either way, click or scan now to watch my Nebula debut, or I'll see you in court. Now, the Justice Department investigated Hernandez for many years, including during Trump's first administration, and received little, if any, attention from most mainstream journalists, which is why I looked into it. Turns out his prosecution is tightly connected to the prosecution of Nicolás Maduro. Both investigations were initiated around 2010 and conducted by the Drug Enforcement Administration almost on parallel tracks, and were prosecuted by the same investigative unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Strangely, all of this was happening behind the scenes while the U.S. and Honduras formed an alliance on drug trafficking and global migration. And despite real questions about whether Hernandez won re-election in 2017 fair and square, in a real sense, both the Hernandez and Maduro investigations illustrate how the supply chain for processed cocaine from Latin America works, how the drug moves from Colombia and Venezuela onto shipment points in Honduras and then to the U.S. On the day that Hernandez left office back in 2022, the Justice Department surprised him by unsealing an indictment in federal court in Manhattan, accusing him of participating in a corrupt conspiracy to facilitate the importation of tons of cocaine into the United States. The indictment pulled no punches. Prosecutors said that Hernandez, quote, abused his position as the president of Honduras to operate the country as a narco state in order to enrich himself and corruptly gain and maintain power. He also, quote, corrupted the legitimate institutions of Honduras, including parts of the Honduran National Police, military, and National Congress, while publicly purporting to be an ally of the United States, contributed with his co-conspirators to Honduras, becoming one of the largest transshipment points in the world for United States-bound cocaine. Of course, allegations aren't evidence, and months later, Hernandez was extradited to the United States and made to face these charges. When announcing the extradition, Damian Williams, the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan under Joe Biden, said that Hernandez allegedly partnered with some of the world's most prolific narcotics traffickers to build a corrupt and brutally violent empire based on the illegal trafficking of tons of cocaine to the United States. He added that Hernandez is alleged to have used his vast political powers to protect and assist drug traffickers and cartel leaders by alerting them to possible interdictions and sanctioning heavily armed violence to support their drug trade. As you can probably tell from all this language, this case was in the works for a long time. For many years, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York and its National Security and International Narcotics Unit slowly built a case not only against Hernandez, but against his brother, the former Congressman Tony Hernandez, as well as other Honduran co-conspirators, a number of whom were federally prosecuted and agreed to cooperate against the bigger fish. Tony Hernandez's trial in 2019 was actually a big deal in his native Honduras. It was during that trial that his brother, the president, was very clearly implicated as an unindicted co-conspirator in what prosecutors at the time described as a broader criminal plan to use drug trafficking to help assert power and control in Honduras. As the Times reported that year, prosecutors had already gone after a network that included at least 7 officers of Honduras' National Police Force, the son of the country's previous president, several members of the Rosenthal family, a prominent Honduran banking and political family, and at least 2 former Honduran mayors. That's a lot of people. At one 2017 sentencing, the Times reported, one prosecutor said that the evidence amassed in this investigation showed, quote, state-sponsored drug trafficking. According to the government, at the top of this operation was Juan Orlando Hernandez. Among other accusations, prosecutors said that the president used millions of dollars in drug money to help him win elections, and that he offered protections to drug traffickers who supported him. From his native Honduras, the president repeatedly and vigorously denied all these allegations. Once Tony Hernandez's trial got underway in 2019, prosecutors told jurors that among the figures funneling money to the Hernandez operation was none other than Joaquin Guzman Loera, the Mexican drug kingpin known as El Chapo. and that the money, a whopping $1 million, was intended to boost the president of Honduras. Eventually, both Hernandezes were convicted at trial. Tony was sentenced in 2019 to life imprisonment, and his president brother received 45 years in 2024. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to make a quick parenthesis here because this part will blow your mind. It certainly blew mine. You won't believe this, but there was one New York prosecutor who played a leading role in investigating and prosecuting the Hernandez brothers, and even Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro and his own alleged network of narcoterrorism. You know his name because he is well known to this channel. Emil Bovy. That's right. The Trump loyalist who became Donald Trump's defense lawyer in his New York criminal trial over hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and later was rewarded with a top post at the Justice Department, only to be further rewarded with a lifetime appointment as a federal appeals judge, was a key figure in piecing together the complex drug trafficking investigations that brought down Tony and Juan Orlando Hernandez and many others. At the time of these investigations, he was the co-chief of the National Security and International Narcotics Unit at the Southern District of New York. Remember that bit about state-sponsored drug trafficking? Bovy repeated those words during closing arguments at the trial for Tony Hernandez. According to the Associated Press, Bovy outlined for the jury how Hernandez paved the way for nearly 200,000 kilos of cocaine to be shipped into the United States, and how the government had to flip some of Hernandez's own associates to become government witnesses. These witnesses had their own baggage. According to Bovy, they had admitted to dozens of killings and the torture of individuals, committing crimes every bit, if not more tragic and awful than the defendants. But Tony Hernandez and his brother were higher up in the chain. He said the defendant had so much power in Honduras that anyone who challenged his authority was murdered. Bovy's role was so central to these cases that Univision, the Spanish language network, reported his resignation with urgency. Would that jeopardize Juan Orlando Hernandez's own prosecution down the road? No such thing happened. He was indicted anyway, but just to show how big a deal Emil Bovy was to these prosecutions, when he gave notice in the separate Maduro case that he was withdrawing from the prosecution, an AP reporter tweeted, "Latin American narcos may sleep easier. Tomorrow is the last day for the prosecutor who indicted Nicolás Maduro, Hugo Carvajal, and the brother of Honduras' president on drug charges." Now there's more. Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, reacted to that reporter's tweet and added his own spin. I'm going to say it in Spanish because it sounds better, and it's also funnier. Bukele said, "El gobierno de los Estados Unidos acaba de destituir al fiscal que metió preso al hermano de Joe por narcotráfico. Luego dicen que están preocupados por la justicia en nuestros países. Es evidente de qué lado están, y no están del lado de nuestra gente." Something like, the US government just fired the prosecutor that imprisoned the Honduran president's brother for drug trafficking, and then they say that they're worried about the justice system in our own countries. It's clear on whose side they're on, and they're not on the side of our people. Bukele, the guy complaining about the US going soft on drug traffickers, later took millions from the US to send them hundreds of men accused of being gangbangers and terrorists to fill his brand new and brutal mega prison under the Alien Enemies Act. That guy? You couldn't make it up if you tried. Anyway, that's water under the bridge. Fast forward to late last year, and yet another Trump henchman, the notorious Roger Stone, was reportedly involved in the pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez. Turns out that the convicted president wrote a really obsequious letter to Trump. Hernandez wrote, "Just as you, President Trump, have suffered political persecution targeted by the Biden-Harris administration, not for any wrongdoing, but for political reasons." He added, "Like you, I sought only to serve my people, to uphold our conservative values while leading unprecedented reforms to make my country stronger and safer. And like you, I was recklessly attacked by radical leftist forces who could not tolerate change, who conspired with drug traffickers and resorted to false accusations, lawfare, and selective justice to destroy what we had achieved and clear the path for the Honduran radical left's return to power." It didn't hurt, of course, that Stone interceded directly on Hernandez's behalf. Remember, the Trump presidency doesn't care about justice, or else they do something about the huge backlog of clemency applications gathering dust at the Justice Department. The pardon power in this era, as I've explained before, is only accessible to the highest bidder, or to people with friends in high places. And that's how, the same week that Trump pardoned a turkey, he pardoned a convicted former head of state accused of narcoterrorism, just like Nicolás Maduro. And after the pardon, the special treatment didn't stop there. Instead of being handed over to immigration authorities like most foreign drug convicts are, Hernandez was quietly driven from the federal prison in West Virginia to Manhattan, where he ended up at the Waldorf Astoria. Who wouldn't love that? Not exactly the usual exit plan for someone sentenced to 45 years for cocaine trafficking. When asked for comment by the New York Times about this astonishing pardon, Emil Bovy didn't defend his prior work as a prosecutor, and he didn't lament that with the stroke of a pen, Trump flushed all that work down the drain. Bovy stuck up for his former boss, the one who rewarded him with a federal judgeship. He said, quote, "I'm proud to have previously represented and served President Trump, and I completely trust and respect this judgment in exercising the pardon power, which the Constitution vests in him alone by virtue of his mandate from the American people." A sitting federal judge really said all those things on the record about the president who appointed him. What a time to be alive. So there you have it, folks. The president of the United States and his loyalists only care about their own self-interest. On paper, the Maduro charges are all about narcoterrorism and official corruption at the highest levels of the Venezuelan government, and about how his corruption then served as a conduit to flood our country with drugs, or so prosecutors say. Does the president really care about any of this as much as he cares about Venezuela's oil or Venezuelan democracy and self-determination? Highly doubtful. As I wrote in my own dispatch from witnessing the Maduro arraignment, if there's one thing that's certain is that as far as the Constitution and the laws are concerned, in this courtroom, the Trump administration will not be forced to play by the rules. The U.S. justice system isn't perfect, but in a courtroom, the rules matter. The case is now moving slowly through pretrial motions, exactly as federal criminal cases do. The next hearing has already been pushed back as the judge sorts through the early constitutional challenges. It's a reminder that once a defendant enters a federal courtroom, even a former head of state, the process moves on the court's timeline, not the president's. And already the constitutional fights have begun. Maduro's lawyers have moved to dismiss the case entirely, arguing that the U.S. government itself interfered with his right to counsel as protected by the Sixth Amendment. The Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, which handles U.S. sanctions, initially allowed Venezuela to pay his legal fees and those of his wife. But less than 3 hours later, the government revoked that authorization. His attorneys say that this makes it impossible to mount a proper defense. Why does the U.S. even care how Maduro funds his defense? Because, as Spencer explained, Maduro is arguing he is still the Venezuela president and therefore immune from prosecution. The U.S. rejects that claim because it regards him as illegitimate. So if the U.S. lets Venezuela pay for Maduro's lawyers, it could strengthen his claim that he's still the legitimate head of state of Venezuela and therefore qualifies for head of state immunity. The next status conference in the case is scheduled for March 26. These hearings usually focus on scheduling, setting deadlines for motions, discovery, future proceedings, so the big constitutional issues may not be resolved just yet, and yet others may be raised later on. But those questions are on deck because the facts and the law matter. And the lawlessness we've seen on the world stage of late won't fly in the world of pretrial motions, Brady disclosures, and cross-examinations. Trump may end up flushing even Maduro's prosecution down the drain later on. But for now, he needs to show us and the rest of the world what he's got. I'm from Chile, that long, beautiful stretch of land in South America. I was born during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, so I'm not here to make excuses for Maduro and his brutal hold on power, about his years of documented human rights abuses, or for running his country to the ground, causing a migrant crisis that has sent millions of Venezuelans to other nations, scrambling to take refuge throughout the world, especially in Latin America. And so as a U.S. citizen with South American roots, sitting in the same courthouse as Maduro, it was extraordinary in how ordinary this whole proceeding was. And as a legal journalist, I'm most interested in what will ultimately happen in this case and to this defendant, and if the rules that apply to everyone else apply equally to someone who for many years was above the law. Maybe our own president will learn a much-needed lesson precisely about that.
Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems, and they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front and your lawyers only get paid if you do to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.